In April 2015, on a dating website called Plenty of Fish, a 23-year-old woman came across the profile of a young man from Cardiff. From the moment she saw his profile, she was drawn to him. He was exceptionally handsome, a university student, and the son of a man who owned a major local business. He was also an avid sportsman, with a black belt in karate. But she could never have imagined that none of it was true, or that this moment would change her life forever. 16 months later, on an August morning in 2016, that young woman died in a Cardiff hospital. She was only 24 years old. Her death would go on to become one of the most extensively covered criminal cases in the British press that year, and when the news reached China, it immediately became a subject of discussion among millions of people. What made the case so unforgettable was not the brutality of the crime. It was the fact that the victim herself had deliberately covered up the violence committed by the man who would later kill her. Cardiff was originally a port city. With vast reserves of coal buried deep beneath the ground, it had grown into one of Europe's busiest ports by the beginning of the 20th century. But when the age of coal came to an end, the city was forced to find a new source of life, and that source turned out to be students. Today, Cardiff is one of the most popular destinations for international students in the United Kingdom. The cost of living is far more affordable than in London. Its universities have histories stretching back hundreds of years, and the city is just small enough that a young person far from home doesn't feel swallowed by it. In 2012, among the tens of thousands of students arriving there each year was a Chinese woman who had just turned 20. Her name was Xixi. She was born on April 24, 1992, in the city of Nanjing, Jiangsu Province. Xixi first arrived in the United Kingdom when she was only 15 years old. At an age when most of her peers were still being woken by their mothers for school each morning, she had already flown to a foreign country. She studied English at a private school before moving to Oxfordshire to attend a university foundation program. In 2012, she enrolled at Cardiff Metropolitan University, majoring in international hospitality and event management. It was a carefully considered choice because her family expected that after graduating, she would return to China and help manage her father's business empire. Xixi stood about 5 feet 1 inch tall and weighed approximately 97 pounds, making her the most petite student in her class. But she spoke 4 languages: Chinese, English, French, and Spanish. A senior lecturer in the management department described her as enthusiastic, energetic, and highly confident. She always submitted her assignments on time, and her grades consistently placed her among the highest performing students in the class. Her classmates described her in much the same way. They said Xixi never behaved like a spoiled daughter from a wealthy family. She was sociable, generous, and seemed to always have a smile on her face. During the holidays, she traveled across Europe with her friends. Looking at the photographs she posted on her social media pages during those years, you'd see a 20-year-old woman living through some of the most beautiful years of her life. Xixi's father was Guoqiang Bi, born in 1968. He was one of the principal founders of Yurun Group and served for many years as the general manager of the food conglomerate. The name Yurun may be unfamiliar to many people, but it's one of the largest meat and sausage brands in China. According to a former employee, Mr. B was the man who laid the foundation for the country's standards governing chilled and fresh meat. In 2007, after disagreements over how the company should be managed, he left Yurun and began his second business venture by establishing Runheng Logistics Company in Jiangsu. He later took control of Baodi Agricultural Group in Tianjin. On the 2016 Hurun China Rich List, he ranked 548th with a fortune of 6.7 billion yuan. That figure included only his assets in Tianjin, while Runheng Group alone reported total assets exceeding 30 billion yuan. With decades of business experience, Mr. B understood that sending his daughter abroad to study would give her an opportunity. She'd receive the best possible education, mature earlier, and learn to become independent. But on the other side of that decision was a 15-year-old girl who had to learn how to live alone, more than 5,500 miles from home. She'd continue living that way for nearly 10 years. right up until the final day of her life. In 2011, while studying in Oxford, Xixi met a young British man. They fell in love, and the following year, they were both accepted into Cardiff Metropolitan University. Their relationship lasted for about 3 years before ending in 2014 because of cultural differences. However, the separation was amicable, and they remained in contact as friends afterward. The next person she met was named Jordan Matthews. Matthews was 1 year younger than Xixi. He was born and raised in Cardiff, in a large family with 2 younger brothers and 3 younger sisters. When he was still a teenager, his parents separated and later divorced. According to his mother, Matthews had suffered violence within his own family from a very young age. After his parents split up, he was forced to change schools, and at his new school he became a target of bullying. By the age of 16, he had dropped out altogether and begun working to support himself. With his education ending at the high school level, the jobs available to him offered little promise. He started by washing dishes in restaurants, then worked as a kitchen assistant, waiter, and bartender, moving from one pub to another across the city. The pay was low. The work was never stable. It was during those years that Matthews found something to cling to, and that something was martial arts. He watched every Jackie Chan movie he could find, taught himself snake-style kung fu from a screen, and then, after realizing that what he'd learned was little more than flashy movement, enrolled in a karate class. Along with martial arts, he developed a particular fascination with Chinese culture. To anyone who knew him, he repeatedly insisted on 2 things: that he held a black belt in karate and that he was determined to marry a Chinese woman. In April 2015, the 2 of them exchanged messages for the first time. Many articles about this case claim that they met on Tinder. That's not true. Plenty of Fish was launched in 2003, nearly a decade before Tinder, and it differed in one very important way. It allowed users to write lengthy profiles describing their occupation, education, and family background. In other words, it gave someone the freedom to invent an entire identity for themselves. That detail may seem insignificant now, but by the end of this story, you'll understand why it mattered so much. Their first date went beautifully. They lay together on the grass, listened to music, and talked until late into the evening. Then Matthews claimed that he'd missed the last bus and stayed overnight at Xixi's apartment. At the time, Xixi was entering the final stage of her university program, and Matthews offered to help her with her coursework. That was what brought them together as a couple. In Xixi's eyes, Matthews was a tall British man with blonde hair, blue eyes, and an athletic build. He told her about the university he was attending, his father's business, and the years he had spent training in karate. And Xixi believed every word. Not long after moving in with her, Matthews lost his job. Other reports suggested that he'd deliberately quit because continuing to work at the pub would have exposed all of his lies. It should have been nothing more than a temporary setback. But he made no effort to find another job. Instead, he stayed at home, and from that point forward, the entire cost of supporting them both fell on Xixi's shoulders. She paid the rent, covered the utility bills, bought his clothes, paid for food, and purchased everything they needed for the apartment. She took him on several trips abroad, which, according to people who knew them, were the first times Matthews had ever left the United Kingdom. She even bought him a car. Eventually, whenever he needed money, he no longer asked her for it. He simply demanded it. But for Xixi, money had never been a problem. She'd grown up in a family where money was the one thing that was always available, and perhaps it was also the only language she had ever been taught for expressing affection, because throughout all the years she lived alone in Britain, her parents had used that very same thing to compensate for their absence. But one detail is especially revealing. At first, the couple lived in an apartment in the city center. When the new academic year began, however, they moved into another apartment that was farther from downtown, older and in considerably worse condition. The reason was simple. Xixi had spent so much money on Matthews that her own finances were no longer as comfortable as they once had been. A 23-year-old heiress living far from home had been forced to move into a rundown apartment because of a man who refused to work. And in return for all of that, what did Xixi receive? For roughly the first year, everything still appeared normal from the outside. Her social media pages were constantly filled with photographs of the two of them attending parties, traveling, embracing, and kissing. To their friends, they simply looked like a couple in love. But from the earliest months of the relationship, Xixi had confided in a close friend named Ivy that Matthews had trouble controlling his emotions and would sometimes erupt into fits of rage for no apparent reason. Ivy urged her to leave him immediately. To Ivy, the fact that Xixi was paying for everything while still being subjected to his anger was completely unacceptable. But Xixi believed that if she treated him well enough, he would eventually change. Then Matthews found out about their conversation. He flew into a rage and forbade Xixi from remaining friends with Ivy. Xixi obeyed him, gradually reduced contact with her friend, and eventually cut her off completely. Forcing Ivy out of Xixi's life was not a sudden outburst of jealousy, it was the first step. Ironically, only a few months earlier, in late December 2015, the United Kingdom had officially criminalized coercive and controlling behavior in intimate relationships. That meant what Matthews was doing to Xixi was already a recognized criminal offense, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The only problem? Xixi herself didn't even know the law existed. By March 2016, Matthews' tone had changed completely. In the messages he sent Xixi from that point onward, there was no longer a trace of affection. Instead, he called her worthless, told her she was incapable of accomplishing anything, and said she would never do anything properly. In front of their friends, he used even more degrading language, referring to his own girlfriend as though she were a filthy prostitute. Then Xixi truly began to disappear. The woman who had once been open and outgoing became quiet and withdrawn, and she lost weight rapidly. Even her former boyfriend, with whom she had remained in contact for 2 years after their breakup, was suddenly cut out of her life completely. At the university, the change was even more obvious. Xixi's attendance steadily declined. Her assignments were submitted late, and then not submitted at all, often because Matthews forced her to skip class and stay home with him. The student who had once always turned in her work on time and consistently ranked among the highest in her class finished the first semester of her master's program having failed every subject, forcing her to start over from the beginning. Her lecturers noticed immediately. They said Xixi had become a completely different person from the young woman who had first enrolled. There was something else that would only be mentioned much later. Xixi had always been strongly opposed to drugs, but under pressure from Matthews, she began smoking marijuana with him. One by one, everything that made Xixi who she was had been taken from her. Her friends, her education, her appearance, and even the principles she had lived by. In the end, she also lost the belief that she deserved something better. In May 2016, an incident occurred that should have been the final warning. Matthews traveled to Spain to visit his biological father, but at the hotel, the two men became involved in such a violent confrontation that his father ordered him to leave immediately. When Xixi heard what had happened, she felt sorry for her boyfriend. She paid the fee to change his plane ticket so he could return to the United Kingdom earlier, and even offered to pick him up at the airport. The only response she received was 2 words: "For off." That same month, Xixi's older brother, Xixi, who was studying at the University of Nottingham at the time, had an opportunity to see his sister. He immediately noticed that she had lost a frightening amount of weight, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes that even a thick layer of makeup couldn't hide. When he asked what was wrong, Xixi lied, saying they were simply the result of staying up late to study for her exams. It was only later, after Xixi's girlfriend heard about the encounter and quietly spoke to Xixi in private, that Xixi admitted for the first time that Matthews had hit her. In July 2016, Xixi was hospitalized with a broken jaw and had to undergo surgery. When the doctor asked how it had happened, she said she had fallen down the stairs at home. There was one problem with that explanation. The apartment where the couple lived was on the ground floor. There were no stairs inside it, but no one investigated any further. By then, Xixi, like countless victims of domestic violence around the world, had begun lying to protect the very person who was abusing her. While she was in the hospital, Xixi came to visit. This time, Xixi told him directly that she wanted to end the relationship and that Matthews was not someone she could trust. She had finally recognized the problem. She simply didn't have enough time to escape it. On August 18th, 2016, Xixi took a train to London to meet a friend and go shopping. It was probably one of the few pleasant days she had experienced in months. The friend who saw her that day noticed bruises on her face. Around midnight, Xixi boarded a train back to Cardiff and called Matthews, asking him to pick her up at the central station. Matthews became furious. In his mind, being called out at that hour was an insult, proof that she had no respect for him. But he went anyway. And there was something else in his mind, the belief that Xixi had traveled to London not to see a friend, but to cheat on him. The argument began almost as soon as the car pulled away from the station. Matthews angrily questioned her about a message he claimed to have seen on her phone, sent by a man named Ben. Xixi explained that it was only spam, and that she had never even logged into the website. Matthews didn't believe her. He stopped the car, and someone saw him grab Xixi by the hair and drag her out of the vehicle. But that was still not the worst thing that happened that night. At around 1:30 a.m. on August 19th, 2016, a neighbor in the adjoining apartment was awakened by the sound of a man shouting. The neighbor was familiar with that sound. Ever since Matthews had moved in, noises like these had come through the wall almost every night. The shouting, the sound of objects being struck or thrown, and the cries of a woman. They'd grown accustomed to it, and they assumed that this night would be no different. But the noise didn't stop after a few minutes. It continued throughout the night. The sky began to brighten. No one called the police. At 8:30 that morning, Xixi collapsed onto the bedroom floor. Only then did Matthews pick up the phone and call emergency services. During the call, he said that he'd argued with his girlfriend the night before and had hit her, and that she was now struggling to breathe. But what caught the emergency operator's attention was the caller's voice. It was almost unbelievably calm. At one point during the call, he even slipped and called the operator darling. A few minutes later, an ambulance pulled up outside the apartment on Ely Road. Xixi lay motionless on the bedroom floor. Matthews stood nearby, frantically insisting, "I only hit her a few times." One member of the emergency crew later recalled, "The moment I first saw her, I thought we had arrived too late." Xixi B died at the hospital later that same day. August 19th, 2016. The results of the autopsy would leave even the most experienced professionals stunned. There were a total of 41 injuries on her body. Bruises covered roughly 1/3 of her body. Her jaw was broken, several ribs were fractured, and alongside the fresh injuries were older wounds that were still healing. That meant she had been beaten repeatedly even before that night. Investigators determined that the injuries had been caused by dozens of blows, with some of the marks suggesting that the attacker may have used an object resembling a metal bar. There were so many injuries that it was almost impossible to identify a single fatal blow. The final conclusion was that Xixi had suffered cardiac arrest as a result of complications from extensive soft tissue damage. In other words, she didn't die from any one strike. She died from all of them combined. Now, remember the first thing Matthew said when the paramedics entered the apartment? He said, "I only hit her a few times." During questioning, his story collapsed layer by layer. At first, it had been only a few blows. Then his story changed again. He insisted that the beating had lasted no more than 10 minutes, but the assault began at around 1:30 in the morning and ended at 8:30. 7 hours. Then there was the black belt. For years, Matthews had boasted to everyone that he held a black belt in karate. During his first interviews with the police, he went even further, claiming to hold black belts in 3 different martial arts. But when he was questioned about the damage someone with that level of training could inflict on a woman who weighed only 97 pounds, he immediately changed his story. He admitted that he had merely been bragging, that he wasn't strong at all, and that he couldn't even lift a sack of potatoes. The black belt had never existed. He also claimed that he would never hit a woman, that such behavior was disgusting, and that the only time he had ever laid his hands on Xixi was to stop her from being struck by a bus. Then, only minutes later, he admitted that he had hit her very hard that night. And what about the message that supposedly triggered it all? Matthews told investigators that he had lost control after seeing a suggestive message on Xixi's phone, sent through the dating app Tinder by a man named Ben. The police later examined Xixi's phone. Tinder wasn't on it. The app had never been installed. There was no such message, and there was no man named Ben. When that explanation could no longer be used, Matthews played his final card. He claimed that he had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and therefore couldn't control his actions. In fact, he'd been using that excuse for a long time. In messages he had previously sent to Xixi, Matthews had essentially told her that because he had ADHD, he couldn't restrain himself whenever she did something he disliked. In other words, he used a medical condition to force his girlfriend to censor every word she spoke and every action she took if she didn't want to be beaten. But when the court demanded evidence, Matthews couldn't produce a single medical record confirming a diagnosis, nor was there any proof that he had ever received treatment. Meanwhile, the evidence gathered by the prosecution pointed in the exact opposite direction. A neighbor testified that throughout the night, they heard crying and moaning coming through the wall. The sounds were intermittent, but they never truly stopped. It had certainly not lasted only 10 minutes. And ironically, the strongest evidence against Matthews in court came from the messages he himself had typed. The trial took place at Cardiff Crown Court in February 2017. Matthews pleaded guilty to manslaughter but denied murder, arguing that he loved Xixi and had even intended to propose to her, so he couldn't have meant to harm her so severely. Lead prosecutor Paul Lewis described it as a vicious, sustained, and prolonged attack. On February 17, 2017, after a trial lasting approximately 10 days, the jury rejected the manslaughter argument and unanimously found Matthews guilty of murder. 4 days later, on February 21st, Judge Nicola Davies handed down the sentence. She said that the assault that night had not been an isolated incident, but the tragic culmination of months in which Matthews had abused Xixi both verbally and physically. She said he had lied in an attempt to clear himself despite the overwhelming evidence against him, and that no matter how difficult his childhood had been, it could never excuse his violence. Then she delivered what was perhaps the most powerful line of the entire trial. She was no physical match for you. You knew that. You took advantage of it. The court recognized two mitigating factors. There was no evidence that he had planned the attack in advance, and no evidence that he had specifically intended to kill her. The remorse he displayed, however, was judged to be insincere. Jordan Matthews was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 18 years before he could apply for parole. Speaking on behalf of the family, Xixi's older brother, Xixi, read a statement in court. He said Matthews had ripped the heart out of their family, that his sister had been expected to take over the family business, and that her future had once seemed limitless. He recalled the last time they spoke on August 18th, while he was traveling in Russia. The final words Xixi said to him were, "Make sure you dress warmly. It must be cold over there." He then said that no sentence could ever reflect the depth of their pain, and no sentence could ever bring Xixi back. In a statement released through the police, Xixi's family said that everything she had was taken from her by the selfish, mindless, and gutless actions of Jordan Matthews, who killed her for no reason other than jealousy. After his daughter's death, Guoqiang fell into severe depression. Now, let's return to the question so many people asked when the case was reported. Why would an intelligent young woman with a family, friends, and financial security endure 16 months of abuse without leaving? Psychology offers one concept that helps answer that question. It was developed by American clinical psychologist Lenore Walker after she treated more than 400 abused women, and she called it battered woman syndrome. The first part is the cycle of violence. Abuse doesn't happen constantly. Instead, it repeats in a fixed pattern. Tension gradually builds, violence erupts, and then comes a period of affection, when the abuser apologizes, expresses remorse, and makes promises. It's this third stage that keeps victims from leaving, because it repeatedly convinces them that there's still good in their abuser, and that if they just try a little harder, everything may return to the way it once was. The second part is learned helplessness. After the cycle repeats enough times, the abused person gradually loses the ability to believe that escape is possible. She stops seeking help and, even worse, begins to believe that the violence is happening because she is somehow to blame. Xixi went through both parts of that process. Domestic violence almost never begins with a punch. It begins with an insult, an irrational fit of jealousy, or a demand to cut off friends. If you or someone you know is in a relationship like that, speak to someone you trust as soon as possible. What do you think could have saved Xixi? A neighbor willing to pick up the phone and call the police? A doctor willing to ask one more question? Or Xixi herself? Leave your thoughts in the comments below.